So my talk today is called The Heart and the Pen, and talk to you about is the things that I learnt when I researched Jane Austen for this book. A lot of the things you will know already, but a couple of the things were very interesting to me that I wanted to share with you today. In my novel Jane in Love, Austen time travels to the present day and she falls in love with a modern day man. The real Jane Austen, as we all know, in her real life, never married or had any children. It's this grand irony of literature that the writer of 6 of the greatest novels about love herself died a spinster. In the novel, this fictional Jane, she time travels to the present day. She falls in love with this modern day guy and she finds herself so happy in the present day that she decides to stay. As soon as she decides to stay with him in the 21st century, all of her books begin disappearing from the shelves. She realises that the longer that she remains in the 21st century, the more she will erase herself from the history books. Eventually, Jane Austen, the writer, will be gone. So ultimately, she has to decide what she's going to do. If she's going to stay in the present, where she's found this love with this wonderful modern day man, and be happy with him, but where she has lost the ability to write, or if she's going to return to her own time, where she won't have this wonderful modern day guy, but she will write her books and she will become Jane Austen. I first read Jane Austen novel when I was 15. I picked up a copy of Emma from a second-hand bookshop. I had no knowledge of this author at the time. I had simply been searching for something to read, something cheap to read, on the train journey home from high school. I went to St Vincent's in Potts Point. I had purchased the book with trepidation. I saw this old cloth cover and I feared that I had picked up a classic from the canon, something that a committee who's designing the school curriculum sets you to read to answer an essay question, a stuffy and inaccessible tome that I'd have to trudge through and that would give me buyer's remorse, essentially. However, I read a few pages and I realised I needn't have worried. I didn't breeze through it. It does contain the inaccessible literature of the 19th century, those long run-on sentences and the jokes always at the end of the sentence. At first it jumbled my modern brain. It took me a few attempts to get through it. Once I grew accustomed to that language, I discovered there was something else in it too, something deeper and something better. It was funny and it was clever. And it contained this knowing humour that rendered it timeless for me, that other books of that era did not contain for me. I loved it and I was hooked. With this fabulous love story, I grew interested in the author. Who was this Jane Austen? One detail of her story bewitched me above all, and I felt disarmed when I discovered it. Jane Austen never married or had any children. The writer of 6 of the greatest novels about love herself died a spinster. A sadness swept over me at this idea. Had she ever been in love? What had gone wrong? Had she had to choose? Considering a career as a writer myself, I grew curious. I researched the biographies of other female authors that I admired. The Bronte sisters, Louisa May Alcott, Emily Dickinson, Sylvia Plath. I felt intrigued upon discovering that all of these women either had disastrous romantic lives or none at all. Women from other artistic disciplines, painters, musicians, so many seemed to fulfil an artistic destiny rather than, or in opposition to, a romantic one. I wondered, does an artist, namely a female one, need to be single or unhappy to create art? And if Jane Austen had to choose between the heart and the pen, what would she choose? And that's how Jane in Love was born. Time travel element was a way to set up the central dilemma of the novel, a writer's choice between love and career. I wanted to see what would happen if Jane Austen were confronted with the reality of the world-famous author that she had become. To see the regard that her work now commands, and if it became a choice between creative fulfilment or love, what would she choose? The dilemma sounds quite mean when you think of it, forcing Jane Austen to choose between true love and her books. But unfortunately, as I want to show this afternoon, I believe this indeed was the choice that was forced upon women of her time who wanted to pursue a creative life. And I believe it confronts women still, even today, though certainly in a lesser form. Creating Jane. A woman with the devil of a genius in her. That's Camilla Carlyle writing about Jane Austen. The first thing I discovered about Jane Austen is that she is an enigma. We have very little biographical information to go on. If you were researching Charles Dickens, Leo Tolstoy, Thomas Hardy, you would find volumes of contemporaneous accounts of them. When trying to find information about Austen, you have a handful of letters which have survived and the sanitised biography of a nephew who was writing 52 years after her death. The rest, is merely speculation, things pieced together. This is for two reasons, I believe. One, because she was only minorly famous in her life and she published her books anonymously. And secondly, because she was a woman. No one bothered to write a biography on her. Love that the banner for the Jane Austen Society of Australia uses this picture, Jane with her back to the camera, because this is who she is for us, an enigma. Getting married was the great question of her life, and yet spinsterhood was not rare. This is one of the things that I discovered in my research. The Napoleonic Wars had created a gender imbalance. Perhaps a quarter of the young men, or maybe even more, of marrying age that is, had not returned from war or had returned too damaged to marry, meaning that there were more women than men. And the chances of marrying, especially if you were a young woman without a dowry or without much of a dowry, they were slimmer even still. Poor Mrs. Stent. It has been her lot to always be in the way, but we must be merciful, for perhaps in time we may come to be Mrs. Stents ourselves, unequal to anything and unwelcome to everybody. Austen expressed this foreshadowing that she would become a spinster herself when writing to Cassandra in her 20s, Cassandra, her sister. There was, and still is, a stigma attached to spinsterhood, as though women's only value is as wives and mothers, and if they are not those things, they are nothing. The main biography I used to research, to create my Jane, was Claire Tomlin's Jane Austen Life. I highly recommend this biography and I'm sure many of you have read it. Carmen Cahill, writing in Daily Telegraph, says, "As near a perfect a life of Austen as we are likely to get, intelligent, feeling, suggestive. Tomlin presents Austen as remarkably clever, sensitive but unsentimental, tough yet observant, guarded, and a woman with the devil of a genius in her." Those adjectives are pretty much spot on what I found when I was researching Austen. The second source of information I found most useful to catch a glimpse of the character of Jane was her letters. The widely circulated statistic is that Austen wrote around 3,000 letters in her lifetime, of which around 161 survived. Who knows how many Cassandra burnt? I primarily accessed these through the Selected Letters of Jane Austen, the one edited by Vivian Jones. I really liked the way that Jones introduced the letters and she set the scene of the wider cultural context. She talks about the Napoleonic Wars and the situation of women at the time. But the star of this text is truly Austen's letters themselves. And reading them in order, I felt immense enjoyment and intrigue. I love her letters because they are unguarded. They're not letters to heads of state or military generals. This is not a president writing to his cabinet with an eye that the letter might be published one day. These are letters about small things. They're usually Jane writing to her sister, writing about the comings and goings, the neighbours, and with Austen's distinct and ironic voice coming through. The letters that I particularly stood out for me were the letters concerning Thomas Lefroy, the letter which I will call Starched Notions, and the letter which I will call Vapour, Shadow, Smoke and Confusion. Thomas Lefroy, who went on to become the Chief Justice of Ireland. These letters give a tantalising glimpse into Austen's brush with love. Fictionalised account is given in the film Becoming Jane. These letters mentioning Lefroy were of particular interest to me because I wanted to know Austen's view on love. This first brush with love, Thomas Lefroy, Austen was 20. Lefroy visited Steventon as a guest of his aunt, who was a family friend of the Austens, Mrs. Lefroy. He stayed in the village where Jane lived from December 1795 to January 1796. He had just finished a university degree and was moving to London for training as a barrister. The first letter is the first letter of Austen's which has survived, written in January 1796 to Cassandra, her sister. I am almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together. Here she uses that lovely ironic and warm phrasing which is singular to Austen, I think. Of course, there's nothing at all profligate and shocking about dancing and sitting down together, and yet there is, because for two young single people of marrying age, it advertises to the world the potential of a romance. It gets people talking. It's exciting to read. You can sense the 20-year-old Austen in the first throes of adult love here, with all the pain and all the excitement that comes with that. The second letter in this series was written to Cassandra just a few days later. I look forward to great impatience to it, as I rather expect to receive an offer from my friend in the course of the evening. I shall refuse him, however, unless he promises to give away his white coat. She's referring to a white coat which she had joked of in the previous letter, mentioning the lightness of it as being Thomas Lefroy's greatest deficit. As I rather expect to receive an offer from my friend in the course of the evening. What a startling line. What is she speaking of here? I'm sure everybody's got a few theories. Is it an offer of marriage? If so, how incredible to speak of it so casually, to afford it only one line in this letter, to bury it amongst other details, and to end off the thought joking about the pale coat. On the surface, one thinks Austen couldn't possibly have been talking about a marriage proposal here, but then would not couching it in such terms so casually and jokingly been exactly Austen's style? Was her lightness here not her guarded nature's attempt at self-preservation? Did she sincerely entertain hopes of a proposal in this moment, and her casual reference to it here attempts at protecting her heart should the endeavour go awry, as it did in the end? Friday. This is in the same letter. She's writing a couple of days later. Friday. At length the day is come on which I am to flirt my last with Tom Lefroy, and when you receive this, it will be over. My tears flow as I write at the melancholy idea. Again, one wonders if she's being serious here or not. To speak so plainly about crying, my tears flow as I write. It's confronting, and one wonders if she was joking. Yet she is speaking with Cassandra, her great confidant and dearest person, and she's candid about to her beloved sister about so many other things. So I would conclude here that she really is heartbroken. The only other mention of Lefroy comes almost 3 years later, November 1798, when she writes to Cassandra in the letter known as Letter 11. Mrs. Lefroy did come last Wednesday. She did not once mention the name of the former, Thomas Lefroy that is, and I was too proud to make inquiries. I felt such warmth and sadness for Austen here, and her words tell much about her feelings for Mr. Lefroy, as does the context in which she wrote them. She's writing almost 3 years after she met Thomas Lefroy and is still too proud to ask of him to family and friends, too guarded to let them know he had any impact on her, for what of herself she might give away in the asking. But she was still hung up on him 3 years later. And that's it. That's the beginning and the end of the contemporaneous accounts of Austen's dealings with Thomas Lefroy. Whatever we think about this escapade, I would argue from this little event that Austen had learned some hard truths about love and loss. and these truths would go on to influence her creative output. In a sense, they shaped her worldview. While Lefroy made an excellent on-paper match for Austen, he was intelligent with the potential to excel in his career. Austen, unfortunately, made no such great match for him. She had little dowry to speak of, and not much in the way of connections to recommend her. Her mother had passing connections to old nobility through the Lee Perror line, but her father was a simple country parson, albeit a very well-read one. Had Austen married Tom Lefroy, in my opinion, she would certainly have not become a writer. Lefroy's career as a man of the law would have come first, I believe. He was a serious fellow who carried the weight of family expectations on his shoulders, and there is no evidence to suggest he approved of Austen's writing. There's no evidence to suggest he knew she was a writer at all, even though at the time that she's writing, she was revising Sense and Sensibility. It is unlikely he would have indulged her passion or encouraged it. That's my opinion. Our heart breaks for Austen to see her in such pain here. But in reality, I do wonder if there was any serious entertaining of affection on the man's part at all, which almost makes my heart break a little bit more, I think. So the second letter that I really enjoyed reading, which I call Vapour, Smoke and Confusion. This is written 5th or 6th of May 1801, in which she describes Bath. So Jane in Love is set in Bath, and it moves between 1804 and the present day in Bath. The first view of Bath in fine weather does not answer my expectations. I think I see more distinctly through rain. The sun was got behind everything, and the appearance of the place from the top of Kingston was all vapour, shadow, smoke and confusion. At this point in her life, Austen had been to Bath before on holiday, staying with wealthy relatives and attending assemblies. But at this point, the Austens had relocated there. The idea of being in Bath had become a more permanent one to her, and Austen is coming to grips with a place she may have to live in for some time. The idea of living in Bath was a little bit ridiculous to her, the place that other people went on holiday. A modern day equivalent might be moving to Las Vegas. We see that Austen thought of Bath as quite a crass place. She depicts the vulgar, new money Mrs. Elton as coming from Bath. She set 2 novels there, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. Well, the former, Northanger Abbey, is a satire of Gothic novels and uses Bath as a ridiculous setting in which to have her fun. I do quite like that Persuasion, the final novel she completed before she died, Austen comes full circle and seems to make her peace with the place as she sets the scene for the beautiful and heartfelt reunion between Anne and Captain Wentworth. You pierce my soul. Bath's fond claiming of Austen as their favourite daughter is ironic, I found when I was researching this, considering her own ambivalent feelings towards the tourist destination. She lived there from 1801 to 1806. Jane in Love is set in 1804, so roughly halfway through her time living there. Most biographers agree that her parents brought her and Cassandra there to hopefully find husbands. They had met and married in Bath themselves. Cassandra had lost her own beloved fiancé, Robert Fowle, some years earlier, and from what we know, had not had any firm offers since. Jane herself had the flirtation with Thomas Lefroy in her early 20s, and again, from what we know, had no other serious possibilities on that score until Harris big with her in 1802. And I feel it is no small coincidence that this period of living in Bath and what must have been some deal of pressure to find a husband coincided with the greatest period of writer's block that Austen experienced in her short and otherwise, and at other times, very productive life. Very few letters survive from this time. Again, one wonders what Cassandra did with them and what was written in those. We have very little genuine information at all about what Austen's mindset during these years was. We can only speculate. So I chose to set this novel, my novel Jane in Love rather, at a period of her life that I saw as one of flux. She was 28. She was on the verge of spinsterhood, living in a town she largely despised and was there for one reason only, to find a husband. She was still unpublished, with at least one serious rejection of her work under her belt, the rejection from Cadell for First Impressions, and she found herself at a crossroads. The final letter, which appealed to me most, was not so much the letter itself, but simply a line from it. Again, it is a letter from Austen to her sister Cassandra on February the 4th, 1813. I had some fits of disgust. Our second evening's reading to Miss Benn had not pleased me so well, but I believe something must be attributed to my mother's too rapid way of getting on, and though she perfectly understands the characters herself, she could not speak as they ought. I doubt you're quite agreeing with me here. I know your starched notions. An extraordinary glimpse into Austen's little life and the authorly parts of it here are things that I can hardly relate to in this letter. One assumes from the letter that either Austen's mother alone or Mrs. Austen and others are reading aloud one of Austen's novels. Likely it's Pride and Prejudice, as it had been published only a few days ago. I think this is January 28, 1813. The letter was written on February the 4th. I'm getting a nod from Susanna, so hopefully that's right. Yeah. Austen anguishes that her mother is reading out the voices too fast, even though Austen knows that Mrs. Austen understands the characters well enough. It is a particular type of torture, I can tell you as a writer, to sit still while your work is read out in front of you, especially by family members. All you can hear in your head is utter drivel that you've written. That's what you believe. Not the reading, though. That sometimes needs a bit of work. Austen, to her credit, rallies tolerably here, saying that she is vain enough to be well satisfied by either the reading and the book itself or both. She then launches into a critique of the novel, worrying that it wants shade, that it wants to be stretched out here and there with more sense, or even some solemn, specious nonsense will do, something unconnected with the story, like an essay on writing. I found that really lovely because, one has to laugh. I imagine these are exactly the types of angst that every writer feels once their work is published. I remember coming close to a nervous breakdown after Jane in Love came out, where I was wishing that I had written something more boring and something more serious. And I think every writer goes through that. Austen finishes the sequence of worrying by anticipating an eye roll from her dear sister Cassandra, her most patient champion. I doubt you're quite agreeing with me here, she says. I know your starched notions. This final line, I know your starched notions, is probably my favourite line from all of Austen's writings, both her letters and her novels. She's teasing her sister's steady and sensible character here, but there's an element of almost flirtatious affection in it, which is pure Austen for me. This sort of knowing, warm insolence is the heart of Austen's character, and it was this type of texture that I tried to reproduce in Jane in Love. Depictions of Austen that I watched. Films of her life, often in a very admirable effort to show her genius, insert the witty lines from her books into the movie or the TV series or the novel. There's nothing particularly wrong with this, except when the lines are inserted into the mouths of other characters rather than Jane Austen herself. I recall one instance, which I won't mention here, which stuck with me, which gave a paraphrase of the immortal line, "Is a truth universally acknowledged that a man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife?" But they put it in the mouth of a male character. A loving tribute at face value, I actually found this quite egregious, for it made Jane Austen look like a mere stenographer, somebody who listened to the clever and witty things that other people around her said and wrote them down. For me, reading her letters and reading her books, Austen's sense of humour and imagination are singular and entirely her own. So it was very important for me not to do this with Jane in Love. There are lines from her books in Jane in Love, but if they are said, they come out of Jane's mouth herself, with one singular exception, which I won't tell you about now because it might give a twist of the book away. Jane Austen wrote her novels in complete isolation. She did not move in writerly circles. She wasn't Dickens or Tolstoy, who sat around in a smoky cafe talking about craft with other writers. She received practically no formal education, past about the age of about 12-ish. Any novel writing craft came from self-instruction. She taught herself to write. This was probably the most startling detail that I learned about Austen, and it really made me come to appreciate her genius. I endeavoured to make an attentive read of her novels to present this woman with the complexity that she deserves. She was a woman of extraordinary talent, with all the elements that come with that. She was most of the time warm and lively, with a healthy sense of insolence and satire about most things. At other times, she was frustrated. One other thing I discovered, and this is a theory of mine, she may have had better luck in pursuing a creative life with her second close call with love and marriage. This one's certainly a closer call to marriage, though possibly less of love than she came with Lefroy. Harris Bigwither proposed to Austen when she was 26, and initially she accepted his proposal. Harris Bigwither was another family friend. This was not a love match. He had a stammer and was known to be socially aggressive. Austen was 5 years older than him, and it seems he may have proposed after knowing her as a family friend and looking up to her from a young age. His sisters likely encouraged the match. They were good friends of Austen's. It would have been in many ways beneath Austen's dignity to marry this man. They were not intellectual equals, and she would have been doing it purely to secure the financial security of herself, her mother and her sister. I also speculate that the sisters of Harris Bigwither encouraged the match, thinking largely of their brother's happiness and not Jane's. Knowing him to be an awkward sort of man, they perhaps thought the calming influence of Austen would have been good for him. But we cannot know of Austen's heart on this issue. All we know is that she accepted him one evening, then after a night alone, she refused him the next morning. We do know her views about marrying purely for financial security. As they said in Pride and Prejudice, I'm determined that only the deepest love will induce me into matrimony. And from the story of dear Charlotte Lucas, marrying Mr. Collins in a deflating way in Pride and Prejudice certainly echoes the choice facing Austen when considering Harris Bigwither. Thank goodness she neither married Thomas Lefroy nor Harris Bigwither, I say. Due to what society was at the time, Austen probably would have made the best wife, the best mother, and published absolutely nothing. Virginia Woolf argued in her 1929 essay, A Room of One's Own, that space for art is a gendered thing. More specifically, a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. Woolf notes how society expects women to marry and bear children, and that the idea of having original ideas and creative thoughts does not enter the equation. She makes an argument that room, both literal and figurative, is required in order to write or create art, and that women are traditionally shut out from these spaces. Men had rooms to create, to think, to work. Women rarely had a room of their own. This is still the case today, I feel. Not so much, but it still is the case. If there is a home office or shed, it is usually the man's, whereas the woman occupies the communal spaces of the house. She might set up a laptop at the kitchen table or commandeer a bench in the kitchen where children and partners can walk in at any time and commandeer her attention. Joyce Carol Oates says that the greatest enemy to creativity is distraction. And the greatest distraction has to be the interruption of children. As Cyril Connolly says, there is no more sombre enemy of good art than the pram in the hall. And indeed, the opening line, which is the dedication to Jane in Love, all geniuses born women are lost to the public good, by Stendhal. Quite a depressing thought. I don't think it's true anymore, but it once was. However, the greatest indictment confirming that Austen's career would have been non-existent had she borne children comes, in my mind, in a package far closer to home for her than Woolf and Shakespeare's sister. And it is this. Can anybody guess the author of this poem? I send you here a list of all the company who graced the ball with Madam and her maiden sister. Had she been absent, who'd have missed her? Does anybody know the author?
Is it Mrs. Austen?
Very well done, yes. It is Cassandra Lee Austen. Cassandra Austen, Jane Austen's mother, frequently wrote her recipes in verse, that is, as poems. She wrote poems to family members on their birthdays. She wrote poems to entice students back to her husband's school. She wrote poems as condolences when people had died. These poems are domestic in their scope. They're not works of art. They are not about universal themes of nature, and they have nothing to say about the human experience, except maybe on a domestic scale. Yet they contain a command of the craft, a use of rhyme and metre, of word choice that show a mastery of English. Before I began researching Jane in Love, I imagined Jane Austen as a daddy's girl, that her love of reading and her curious nature and her intellect came from her father. While I don't argue that Reverend Austen exposed his daughter to books and reading and education, I have no question about that she might not otherwise have been exposed to, I would argue that Jane's raw talent, her way with words and her sense of humour came not from her serious and academically minded father, but from her mother. There are clashes in later life, I believe, of Jane finding her mother something of a hypochondriac, and her tension with her mother, possibly over her refusal of Harris Pitt with her, stem likely not from having differing personalities, but from having similar ones. If there was ever a case of thwarted potential, it was in Cassandra Austen, Jane Austen's mother, a woman who had a way with words, but because she had 8 children and a school to help run, her only outlet for her creativity was writing her recipes in verse and giving humorous accounts of social events and writing them as poems to amuse herself and often an audience of one. Having written 2 novels now, I know that the key to getting 100,000 words out and then revising them is having that room of one's own, that space, both literal and figurative, in which to write. You need money and time, that's all. Cassandra Lee Austen had neither of these, thus she wrote her recipes in verse. Her daughter, Jane Austen, had time, just enough money to get by, and a room, both literal and figurative, in which to write. And she became one of the greatest writers in the English language. What did I finally try to portray after doing all my research? What did I find? Jane Austen, who was she? A terribly gifted intellect, who honed her writing skills in complete isolation, receiving no help from mentors, teachers, or contact with fellow writers. She also seemed to me a warm but insolent person, introverted and much beloved aunt, sister and friend, who was gripped by sadness and times, and yes, who did want love. There is an extraordinary paradox at the heart of Jane Austen's life. The majority of Austen's books represent a fantasy of her own life, that is, a poor, witty woman who wins at life by marrying far above her station, largely from getting through on her excellent brains. Whereas in her own life, in order to pursue her dream of writing, Austen could not possibly have married. It is this paradox which captured my attention and commanded me to write this book. Delighted that Jane in Love is set to become a movie. Very busy at the moment and very happy that I've been commissioned to write the screenplay for Jane in Love, the movie, which is set to be turned into a feature film by Amazon Studios. It's produced by Denovi Pictures, the Oscar-nominated producers of Little Women. It's been a delight working with Denovi. They're very clever and very wonderful ladies. And if anybody's got some suggestions of who you think might play Jane or who might play the love interest, please send them through. My second novel is called Secrets My Father Kept. The idea for Secrets My Father Kept came to me during the editing process for Jane in Love. The fact that Jane Austen never married or had any children, despite writing 6 novels about love, has always bewitched me. I grew fascinated by the choices that women must make between these 2 things if they wish to pursue a career. I wondered what other settings and characters I could explore this idea. In Secrets My Father Kept, the main character, Marie, wants to become a doctor, and she encounters tremendous opposition. This is set in the years leading up to World War II. With her mother missing, she also seemingly lacks any positive female role models to aspire to emulate. So this idea of Austen having to choose between one or the other, between a relationship and her career, it just keeps coming back to me. The wonderful guys at Dimmocks are here. They've got some books to sell. If you'd like to buy one, I will sign it for you. And I'm just really honoured to be here today. Thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you for having me. Any questions? Yes, if anybody's got any questions, please let me know.
So Rachel, you now have a pram in the hall and
I
have
do.
had for 5 months. So how have you managed to get screenplay for the exciting movie version,
Yes.
plus a new book finished? How are you juggling the room of your own and the pram in the hall, which was a fabulous
It's an excellent
quote, wasn't
question.
it?
Yes, an excellent question. Thank you, Susanna. I read it in a panic, a room of one's own, because it really, really bothered me that, can women actually do it? So, Woolf she puts a loophole in a room of one's own. She went back and she looked at all the writers throughout history, and she said, surely there must be somebody who was able to do both. And she found one, a writer from the 1600s, who managed to write and have children and have a family. And the loophole is this: you must have an excellent husband. And I do have an excellent husband. His name's David, and that's who is looking after my 5-month-old son Finn at the moment. Yes, and I think you need an excellent husband. You also need a bit of a village to do it. And also, I went to a talk with women in law and business on International Women's Day, and one of the ladies up there, she was fabulous, and she said, yes, you can do it. You can have both, but just maybe not in the order that you thought. So you might do the kids first and then you do your career, or you might do a bit of career first, and then once you're established you can go on and have a family. Yeah.
I noticed, Rachel, you've got this cover, but you also, with I think with
Oh,
the
yes.
picture, you had the other one.
Yeah.
What choice as a writer did you have? Yeah, that one.
So
what choice did you have when it came to the cover?
Yeah, it's interesting to see how everybody interprets it. So this cover here is the US cover. This cover here is the Aussie and New Zealand cover, and there's also a Romanian cover, which is really beautiful as well. It's different. It's like the bust of Austen, and a modern day London skyline in the background. It's really nice. It has like this lovely sort of ghostly feel to it. I really like it. So they send you the cover and they say, here's the cover, we really hope you like it. And that's about it. But usually I love all the covers. I think they're wonderful. I love how this cover has the 3 busts of Austen, and almost like, and they get sort of, the colours get more blue as it goes on, almost like the longer she stays, the more she fades away. And they've also got Austen's handwriting in the background as well. So I thought that they did a really beautiful job, yes. So, but if I had problems with it, you just have to grin and bear it. But no, it's great. Yes. Up the back, or yeah.
I understand why you concluded that if she married, she wouldn't have written.
Yes.
That makes me horrifically sad.
I know.
It probably makes me even more romantic than
I know.
I guess I would like to think if the Napoleonic Wars had not decimated the population of young men of her time, she may have found an excellent
Yeah.
She may have written, but I think she also needed an excellent rich husband.
Yes.
Because I think, as well as excellence, means are important to supporting a career for women, especially in her generation.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's terribly sad.
I know.
Like you, I first read it when I was 15, and it makes me terribly sad now, a lot later than 15.
Yeah. So do you think that Harris Bigwither might have been okay because he was wealthy? Because I was thinking he sort of looked up to Austen, and in time she might have been able to sort of convince him. You don't think so? No.
She might have died in childbirth, having the 11th baby. Yeah, that was such a risk, wasn't it?
That's one of the things that, in the letters, everybody's death, what do they call it? Childbed death? Death in childbed or something? Goodness me. Yes, no, you're right.
Did you know that Harris's descendants live in Sydney?
Really?
Yeah. He's a doctor, so I see this Dr. Bigwither on the plaque, and I've walked past it quite often because it's near where I live.
Yeah.
And I have actually met some of the descendants.
Wow.
And I think, oh, thank goodness she wasn't Jane Bigwither. It just doesn't have the same ring to it. It's Jane Austen. Okay, I think there was a question up the back there, Harriet.
In terms of the verses, read Stravinsky's Lunch by Priscilla Majesto.
No, what's it about?
She explores that idea of examining the lives of Stella Cohen and Grace Cossington Smith.
Yep.
But the reason for the title, which seems confusing, if I can just have a couple of minutes, because I think it's a lovely story. She said she was at a lunch with some friends and someone told her the story of Stravinsky, the composer, and that when he was in the throes of composition, his wife and his children had to be silent at lunch so he wouldn't be distracted.
Yeah.
In this group of people who are talking about it, the men were all, yes, the karaoke, the importance of art, and the women were all, why didn't his wife give him lunch on a train? And she just wanted to explore, if you're a woman, how do you balance this, this family responsibilities versus following your own. And I thought it's really interesting when she's talking about Stella Cohen. She's stretching a bit when she's talking about Grace Cossington Smith, but it's a really enjoyable read.
Oh, I'll check it out.
Having said that, I read it 15 years ago.
Yeah.
At the time, I thought it was a really enjoyable read.
Yeah. No, that's great.
It explores that same idea but through to artists rather than writers.
Yeah, oh, that's wonderful, because I'm going back, like I'm revisiting Jane in Love because I'm writing the screenplay at the moment, so that would be something great for me to read, just to revisit the theme. Yeah, great, thanks.
I think an interesting point that Rachel makes in her novel, when Jane Austen comes into the 21st century, there's a film version going on of Northanger Abbey,
Yes.
and the character that she meets is having to play Mrs. Allen, and she thought she was going to be the heroine, and because she's just getting on a little bit in her career and her looks are fading a little bit, so the whole feminist thing comes into that, you know,
Yes.
what sort of roles do women get
Yes.
once they are getting on a little bit and they're no longer the star heroines
Yes.
of the novel or the movie.
That's
So,
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I really like that touch. That
Oh,
the
yeah,
way you
thanks.
brought in Mrs. Allen, who's a great favourite of mine.
Yeah, she's great.
You had a lot of fun with her.
Yeah, she's sort of, and Jane, when she observes what's being done to this poor actress, who's a brilliant actress, but has always been cast as Batgirl or, you know, the spunky sidekick or the sex pot. And she's been asked to play this ridiculous character who she is going to do beautifully, but she keeps trying to do it sexy, which is not what Mrs. Allen is at all. And Jane, the fictional Jane, sort of observes this, and she says, what surprises me most about the 21st century is not how much things have changed, but how much the other things have stayed the same. Women are still valued for their looks above other things. Yeah.
I also love the way you connected it with online dating, sort of swiping right, and you know, actually, it's not all that far removed from
No.
dating in Jane Austen's day.
No, it was a
What's
meat
his bank
market.
balance? Oh, swipe right. You know, he's boring and boorish like John Thorpe. Swipe left.
Yeah.
And I love the way you.
Oh, good. Oh, please.
And I guess Elizabeth Gaskell is one of the few women who managed to combine motherhood, being the wife of a minister, and writing.
Yeah.
There's not many, are there?
No, there's not. Mary Shelley, maybe. I think she had a baby when she wrote Frankenstein. Yeah.
Poor Mary. Yes, that's an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, look at the thing I have created.
Yes.
Yeah. It's alive. Yeah.
And a husband who was all over the place.
Yes, a bit Percy, yes.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to call on Julie to come and thank our speaker.
Rachel, on behalf of JASA, I'd like to thank you so much for your fascinating talk today, sharing your insights into the creation of this delightful novel. I have read it, thoroughly enjoyed it,
Oh, thanks, Jane.
and can highly recommend it. I can't wait for the movie. There were so many aspects to enjoy. The engaging narrative woven with those interesting characters and the subplots, twists and turns. The way you captured Jane's experience in the modern world, the wonder, and how you evoke that wonder in and then that romantic pull and the choices she had to make to preserve that legacy. The role of Jane's letters in the outcome, and then your understanding of her in the research for that book was a fascinating bringing together. So thank you so much for creating this wonderfully fresh reimagining of Jane Austen and sharing your journey and your interpretations with us today.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.